Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 30th of September, the last day of September 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thank you very much for taking some of your Tuesday evening out to share it with us. Really appreciate it. Have an interesting conversation today with Aaron and, of course, the founder of bRight, or co-founder, I think, of bRight, and or bRight Agent to give it its full name. And we'll bring him in just a second. Just before I do that, let me remind you that we don't provide specific financial or property advice. It's a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, suggestions in as we go. And if you've got a question for me or Aaron, if you use that Walk the World, that'll get into my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who do support us, either via the Super Chat or via Patreon or via PayPal. It really helps to cover the cost of what we do. We don't do this for profit. We do this because there's a really important conversation to be had. And thanks very much for all of those who support us. Right. And now let me bring Aaron straight in. Hello. How are you doing?
Hi, Martin. Great to be with you as always. And I don't know about you, I'm quite excited for tonight's discussion.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I don't know whether you want to explain the garb now or later. When you want to do that, because everyone's going to ask.
Well, I might do that as we go. There's a little bit of symbology tonight. It is mortgage debt Christmas Eve, I feel. You mentioned the 30th of September just a moment ago, and I feel that essentially this is the night before debt Christmas. I think from here on, we're going to see a lot of people swimming in debt. And I might allude and use a few metaphors as we go through the show tonight about why I'm wearing this Christmas sweater and snorkel, Martin.
Absolutely. Well, I was thinking, getting underwater, getting trapped. All so there's a bunch of questions we can come on to. But let's just start the conversation with a little bit of a wander around the Reserve Bank, right? Because the RBA actually did make their decision today. They held the cash rate, which is no surprise to pretty much anyone. But it was quite interesting. They said both the headline and trimmed mean inflation were within the 2-3% range. And there's a bit of volatility there. But actually, interesting, inflation is a bit higher perhaps than expected at the time of the August statement. I thought that was quite interesting. The private demand is recovering. In other words, household consumption is perhaps rising a little, maybe because real incomes are rising, although I'm skeptical about that across the board. Housing market, they say, is strengthening, a sign that recent interest rate decreases are having an effect. So they almost are celebrating the fact that prices are rising, which is quite surprising. Credit's readily available to both households and businesses. Not small businesses. My small business survey suggests a lot of people are struggling still. Growth in employment has slowed slightly, but it's still 4.2%. Wages growth has eased from its peak, but productivity growth has been weak and growth in unit labour cost remains high. So that's sort of a starting point. And by the way, just for highlighting this is actually the wage price index, but also the newly approved EBAs, the enterprise bargaining agreements, and they're rising. And I think that's a very significant forward indicator of potentially more inflation ahead. And I've got this basic view that inflation is probably more well wedded in than a lot of people would think. They went on to say that there are uncertainties about the outlook. On the domestic side, strong unexpected data on growth and inflation may indicate households have become more comfortable consuming as real incomes and wealth rise. Alternatively, growth in consumption might not persist if households become more concerned about overseas developments or indeed inflation. Uncertainty of the global economy remains elevated, and there's also the question of the lag effect. How long does it take for the 3 rate cuts to work through? That's still an unknown question. It's also worth just taking this on board that, of course, Australia ranks among the worst for productivity growth, and the RBA again mentioned productivity. Mexico's worse, but pretty much everyone else is better than us. This is according to the OECD analysis. Now, okay, they did actually adjust it to purchasing power in the US when they did this, which makes it worse. But nevertheless, the truth is that unit labor costs rose by more than 4.4%, and that's a problem in terms of actually productivity. So their conclusion was that they are going to wait and see, cautious. We're going to talk about heightened uncertainty in the outlook. But actually, my take was that there was probably more expectation for rates to stay rather than necessarily drop. And the risk to inflation on the upside is also probably higher than it was previously. So that's an important factor, particularly when people are thinking about potentially now getting into the market, buying that property, perhaps a first-time buyer, getting a 95% mortgage, and rates may not come down, folks. So just bear that in mind.
No, that's right. And I think you've summed it up really nicely. It looks to me that they're trying to hedge their bets a little bit. We know that the jobs market is weakening. Not as many jobs being created as 6 months ago. And at the same time, it's right to say, well, inflation is within the 2 to 3% band, but it makes a really big difference, whether it's 3 going to 2 in that direction, or if it's 2 going to 3 in that direction. Both fit the statement that it's within the 2 to 3% band. I think what we saw only a few days ago really was headline inflation of 3%, and the largest sort of at least monthly read in 12 months or so. So is it within the 2 to 3% band? Yeah, sure. But is it going from 3 to 2, or is it going from 2 to 3? And it makes a really big difference. And I would be equal parts worried about what interest rates do from here, and equal parts worried about whether you still have a job in 6 or 12 months' time. And I think that's something that people should be definitely watching out for.
Yes, and certainly I find, Aaron, that when I speak to people in my one-to-one conversations, they sort of don't necessarily think about the what-if scenarios. What if I lose my job? What if rates don't drop, et cetera, et cetera? And I always say to people, it's important just to sensitize your analysis. Now, if everything goes well, that's fine, but sometimes things happen, and if they do, that's quite relevant. Another interesting and relevant point, by the way, is the tax take. So, tax revenue surges to a 25-year high, and the Chancellor and the Treasurer, I should say, was actually celebrating the fact that the budget was less severely impacted. But of course, if you look carefully, that's because it's actually about personal income tax growth. And in fact, personal income tax collections is now $338.8 billion, or more than 2/3 of all income tax raised by the government last financial year. That is a lot. Plus, of course, from superannuation too. So the truth is that there is a very significant question here about the amount of taxes that's being paid. It's higher than it's ever been. And I see that in my household surveys, of course, because quite often what I see is that we have people who are seeing their incomes rising a little, but they're actually net disposable income is not rising because the tax is going up. And that's something that a lot of people, I think, probably don't fully take into account. And the other interesting observation, Aaron, this is something you might want to comment on, but Sarah Hunter, who's at the RBA now, was talking about the fact that the monthly indicators for inflation are a bit wobbly. The trimmed metric, the quarterly one is probably a more reliable one. It's interesting that Michelle Bullock in the press conference today specifically said, look, I know the RBA is going to start producing monthly inflation data later in the year, full monthly inflation data, but nevertheless, we're still going to stick to the 3-month trimmed indicator as our core indicator for at least another year, a year and a half, because it perhaps gives us a better view. And I think that's a really important point. So I don't think necessarily that we're going to see a massive switch in the story about inflation because of the ABS changing. And interestingly, the comment that Michelle Bullock made was also the fact that the seasonal adjusting on the new view might actually be also be another factor too. So it is quite interesting just to bear in mind that we're not going to see a dramatic change. Now, the other point to make is that if you actually look at the implied futures on the interest rates based on what's happening, this is as at the 29th, we had the implied rate forward about 3 and a bit, but now the latest is 3.24 and going up. And so the expectation from a number of analysts now is that interest rates are probably not going to go down a lot further. Remember, we're talking here about the cash rate. That means that mortgage rates might actually not drop that much. And by the way, some of the fixed rates, which were quite good, have actually become less good recently. So actually, the other point to make is that if people are thinking about the interest rate story, and particularly for mortgages, you need to sort of not necessarily bet on significant rate cuts ahead. So I think that's another factor, going back to your question of underwater or not. The trajectory of interest rates, I think it's a very important factor for people to take account of.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me just try and touch on a few of the items you mentioned there. I believe that the issue of personal income tax was spoken about as part of the productivity roundtable that the government had recently. I didn't see a lot come out of the roundtable when it came to any proposed changes to personal income tax or offsetting those changes against a broader base tax, a GST or anything like that. I think a few questions were put to the government, but largely I didn't see any action items come out of that area specifically. To your comments on the RBA and their use of the monthly data versus quarterly data, it really does beg the question as to why they don't just have 4 meetings a year and then any other meetings by exception. You know, if you got a particularly bad read on employment or something, you would just call the members together and you would do an out of session meeting. Why have almost monthly? I think they've just outside of monthly, sort of six weekly, 8 weekly meetings.
It used to be monthly, but they've roughly 6
they've got
weeks.
Yeah. You know, why not have 4 meetings a year? The week after you get the quarterly data, if that's what you're interested in, and then, as I say, call a meeting by exception if you get a shock one way or the other. I think it does more to obscurate the issues, and it implies that they are paying attention to the monthly data. You'd also be asking the question, well, why does the ABS go to the effort of increasing the fidelity of their monthly data reads if the RBA is not interested in that data set? So I just can't make sense of any of that, to be quite honest. And and then back to the shocks, and I look forward to talking about it a little more this evening. There's any number of issues that could come along. We've already mentioned a couple already tonight. Rates not being adjusted as expected, unemployment, things of that nature. It does not take much to send you underwater. And the equity buffer in your property is essentially your best way of riding out those waves that come along. And the less buffer you have is essentially like swimming with less of yourself above the waterline. And at some point, you're either going under, or you might need an artificial device to keep you afloat, when you can't breathe underwater. So for all of those reasons, I think it's very dangerous to be suggesting that people can just ride out this storm and continue what we're doing.
Yeah, and we can talk a bit later about the agenda the government has in terms of pushing the story. I think one of your earbuds dropped out, by the way, when you moved your helmet, so just bear that in mind. It's one of those technical issues. When you swim underwater with earbuds, you've got to be a little bit careful.
Don't do shows with children, animals, or snorkeling devices. I think is the rule.
Yeah. No, that's fine. But no, there are some very significant issues. Now, one other one which I just want to touch on as we get into this was the latest information on the housing approvals, right? So this is another of those watch what you see, because there's a target for the supply of property which is completely illogical based on what's actually happening. And this is actually what the dwelling units data came out. So the head of construction statistics said the drop in total dwellings was driven by an 8.1% fall in private dwellings, excluding houses, following a 25.8% fall in July. Now, I know that high-rise approvals are lumpy, because by definition, when you get one high-rise building, you'll have lots of development in it. So it is wobbly, but it is interesting to see that they continue to fall. And by the way, private sector houses also fell. down 2.6% in August. And if you look at it, you can see that pretty much the private sector house fell. Fascinating. And it was that New South Wales and Victoria drove the prices in the private sector house approvals, which I find absolutely fascinating because that is a very significant indicator, I think. Now, it did rise in Western Australia and in Queensland, but the private sector house falls driven by the two largest states and were down 8.3% and 6.2% respectively. That's a big deal. And then you can see there apartment approvals, excluding houses, fell. And here are the statistics across the state. So we're not doing that well in terms of the story with regard to, housing approvals. Now, as we discussed in a show with Edwin recently, one of the reasons is that developers aren't actually really wanting to commit much because the cost of building is just, not great, and they're waiting for the government to give them more money. We've also got, of course, the lags between trying to get approvals through the system and actually starting to build. So the chances of them achieving their housing target is pretty limited. And also, of course, if you think of it from a first-time buyer perspective, a lot of properties are beyond the reach of first-time buyers, and a lot of the properties that are being approved now are not actually targeted anywhere close to first-time buyers. So it's actually worse than just the top level approvals. If you're a prospective first-time buyer trying to find somewhere to live, it is really, really difficult. And I've had lots of conversations in my one-on-one conversation sessions with people having to move a long way out or having to compromise dramatically just to find something within their price category, even before the recent changes. So we have a supply issue. Now, there are lots of other issues that we'll touch on in a second, but I do think this is a really important factor. And again, it shows that the words and figures differ between what the politicians are saying they want to do about housing and affordability and what's actually happening. And I would argue that the first-time buyer bribes, I'm going to put that on the table, I think it is a bribe, is part of the government spiel again, but actually isn't necessarily going to help a lot of people.
I think Edwin made the point really well yesterday on the Monday evening property rant that the numbers just don't stack up for high-rise developers. And if the numbers don't stack up for high-rise developers, then the only incentive for those apartments to be more profitable to build is to have less of them and drive the prices up. And so by doing nothing, the prices will continue to rise. So I tend to think of the entire sort of trajectory of new properties and what the government's saying, almost like the run rate required in cricket. If you've got a required run rate of 6 and over, anything less than 6 and over, you're simply not going to catch that required run rate. You're going to lose the game. And I think the last thing that really anybody wants to see, the government don't want to see it, first homeowners don't want to see it, is a change, backwards. Not only are we not meeting the required run rate, but the number of runs per over is getting worse with each sort of session. So, and nobody wants to see that. Let's be honest. Government would love us to be meeting or exceeding the required run rate, and I think most young people would too, to give them more options. But sadly, that's not the reality. The other part here, and it's certainly not a get out of jail free card, but you've got to wonder how much the government can actually do in the market. And then so for that reason, really, the question should be asked, should we be setting such ambitious targets and perhaps raising people's expectations a lot if we don't hold the levers to be able to do much about it?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And of course, there's a supply-demand question here. And, demand is, as we'll see in a second, is partly driven by the quite strong migration, but also the fact that the ability of people to borrow more is still there. And that's another factor. So we've got this. The bottom line is that they're using the property sector as effectively a crutch for the whole economy because that's pretty much the only game in town, particularly now with perhaps the resources boom coming off too. And when you actually sort of put all the pieces together, first the point, the consumer confidence level isn't that high. It's come up slightly, but you can see it's way down from where it was pre-COVID. So there are a lot of consumers out there who are not feeling that confident about things, this according to Roy Morgan. And in fact, I made a show with Tarek Brooker the other day where we talked about Australia's economy is worse than you think, because of course some of the data that people are quoting tries to make it sound pretty positive, but actually when you strip it back, no. And here's a couple of data points just to underscore that. The net migration per 1,000 residents in 2023 in Australia was the second highest. Canada actually had the biggest prize there. But of course, since then, Canada's dropped the migration intake dramatically, and we are seeing now in Canada prices falling and also rents falling, interestingly, whereas in Australia that's not true. And the other interesting data point is this one. This is actually the disposable income. It's the worst in the world over the last little while. This is since March 2022, depending on when you look at it. But the point is, we do have a real issue in terms of the economic foundations of Australia. And so that's another factor in when you are thinking about making and committing a decision yourself to buying a property. You've got to think about your own situation, but also think about the slightly broader situation. Oh, and by the way, just in case there's any concern about what's happening with rents, this article just highlights the fact that in fact we can see Sydney and Brisbane rents rising significantly higher than the average. So that was very interesting because, of course, the ABS suggested that maybe rent growth was easing, but no, I'm not seeing it. In my surveys, I'm seeing rental pressure still very, very strong, which means that if you're in the rental sector, you've got a huge amount of pressure. And there are a lot of people in the rental sector, again, according to my one-to-one conversations, who are thinking, well, maybe I should jump across now and grab that opportunity. The government's changing the rules as at tomorrow. We can borrow more and we can get that extra support. So maybe it's time to jump. And my argument is, well, renting is not great, but maybe buying as a first-time buyer ain't great potentially. And, if you want to sort of understand that, here's a couple of data points. So rate cuts and first home scheme fuel loan demand, according to Clancy Yates there. And Westpac, National Australia Bank and ANZ Bank are ruling off their financial year with rising house prices and falling interest rates. Well, maybe we'll debate the falling interest rates. The scheme is open now to all first home buyers, and that could have a material tailwind behind first home buyers. A new report from Citi suggests home loan growth will accelerate further, helped by the effect of past rate cuts and stimulus, including help for first home buyers. And of course, you've got that deposit on the 5 to 20%, which saves you a little money as well. And so there are people suggesting that we're going to see significant growth. Now, I would argue a lot of the benefit of the first home program that we're talking about is going to benefit the banks. They're going to lend more, they're going to lend bigger. And of course, the banks are saying, whoopee, that's great. And it's fascinating. Did you see this one? This was from the Real Estate Institute. First home rush sparked shock price surge ahead of deposit scheme. This was actually updated on the 29th of September. Aussie home prices have jumped by $50,000 the first month, with panic buying sweeping the market as the federal government's expanded home guarantee scheme takes effect. That's a bit over the top. The scheme kicks off on Wednesday, removes place and income limits and raises property price caps, allowing more first home buyers to enter the market. And they talked about the market's already in frenzy. In the next few months, once the scheme is cut, it's going to be worse. Property buyers need to calm down and stick to their budgets. I agree with that. Don't overpay. But then they sort of talk about queues in New South Wales and inspections in Victoria, heightened demand for the sub 900,000 units and townhouses. Queensland, offer sight unseen and rapid sales. Western Australia, listings down 25% with 20 offers on the sub 750,000. South Australia expanding eligibility, double the number of servers within reach of first home buyers, and Tasmania buying activity. Oh, look, spruik. Can you smell the spruik?
Oh, look, it doesn't get more FOMO than that, really, does it? I think I was surprised and also not surprised in your conversation recently with Chris Bates to hear that a number of investors have been buying up this bottom end of the market, knowing that this day is coming, knowing that it is essentially that lower price point that that people are going to be clamoring over each other, just like toilet paper in COVID. People are going to be no short of frenzy when it comes to buying up the last sort of skerricks, and it looks like a number of investors have been able to cash in on that. So, it doesn't get more FOMO than those sorts of articles, and I think the element of sad truth to it is we are likely to see more people rushing in without that due diligence, without knowing what they can truly even afford to repay. Perhaps thinking that the job they're in now, that they'll be in for the next 30 years, and mum and dad will always be there to support them. So those are some of the concerns I have. I've got no doubt that that FOMO is alive and well. People just really need to exercise that caution.
Yeah, I'm afraid that there is a lot of spruiking, and in fact, as Cookie Boy says, the mainstream media is spruiking regional areas as well. Interestingly, when I've done some analysis on regional areas, prices may have risen, but income's not. So the price to income ratios are very adverse in a lot of regional areas. And of course, quite a lot of employment in those areas are a little bit less certain as well. So we need to be a little bit careful, I think, about some of this. And I wrote a show the other day called First Time Buyers in Wonderland, when I went through some of the issues that we're seeing here. The spruiking, the bank of mum and dad still being quite strong, all of the other government support mechanisms that are there for households. There is really a lot. And I tried to get a calculation done as to what the real cost of the schemes, the federal and state schemes for first-time buyers, are actually turning into. It's very, very hard to get any decent numbers because nobody actually reports the numbers. But I can tell you that it's a big number. And of course, the bank of mum and dad is also big as well. So a lot of people are actually tapping their parents and getting $10,000 from New South Wales government and the stamp duty benefits too. So there's a lot of money flowing around there trying to actually pump people into the market. And I just think it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a furphy. And I just worry that people are going to get in over their heads. So going back to your analogy of, are we getting underwater here? There is a real risk. I think people are going to get swept up. And as Edwin said in the rant yesterday, we've seen some people just grab a property without even doing any due diligence, which is always a risk. So now let's then, get to your slides, because you actually put some slides together, and this was quite a neat one, right? Which was having a nice swim, but maybe there's a big wave coming.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wrote an article a few months back now, really, that looked at this issue of deposit amounts, and I tried to make an analogy about swimming in the water and to try and make the point or help people visualize that putting in a 20% deposit, so having an 80% loan, is really like swimming with your head and shoulders above the water. Any waves that come along, you'll be able to rise above them, and you're not likely to sink because of it. But as you get less deposit and a higher loan, you start to be swimming lower in the water. So a 90% loan might be just swimming with your chin above the water. And a 95% loan, so a 5% deposit, 95% loan is really like swimming with just your nose above the water. And if that's the case, then it really doesn't take much of a wave or even a small ripple, Martin, to send you underwater. And so, I thought, well, perhaps that's a good place to start. Maybe we can throw out some waves that come along. Now, again, we've already mentioned a few this evening. Unemployment, I think, is a really concerning wave. And Tarek made the point the other week that unemployment could really rise quite rapidly. This year alone, we've already seen a number of layoffs from large building companies. You've got clothing retailers that have gone out of business. You've got even the banks themselves. I I think NAB are axing about 400 jobs. ANZ slashing a massive 3,500 positions. And then even CBA have had this little on again, off again with whether or not they're cutting staff and replacing them with AI. And so, unemployment is just one wave that could come along. And if you're only swimming with your nose above the water, then really you do not have a lot of wiggle room to be able to absorb that kind of shock. Edwin shared the other night, the house with termites. That's another wave that could very easily come along. Any sort of remediation works, leaks, asbestos, unapproved structures on the property, all really good examples shared of different waves. We know that people are starting to be essentially not able to afford building and home insurance, fire and flood insurance, and so, with more and more homes built in low-lying areas or on the fringes of suburbs, essentially in bushfire-prone areas, those same properties may be at the greatest risk of fires and floods and whatnot, and yet people aren't having the necessary insurance for those properties as well. So that's another wave that could come along. It could be a tree branch, Martin, falling on the roof of your property and needing the money to replace that. That's a sort of an unexpected wave that may come along too.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I had a tree branch come through my place here, but I was insured, so I was able to get my roof fixed, no problem. But yeah, it is fascinating that quite often what we find is that people are actually, over positive with regard to property, and prices probably will rise in the short term. Although interestingly, there are a number of people now suggesting that they're going to rise and then perhaps drop again. In fact, Leith Van Onselen was on the other day talking about this. He thinks that we're going to see a bit of a spike and then a bit of a fall. Now, if you've got a 95% mortgage and prices do begin to slide, that begins to be a bit of a problem for people. And I've always believed that the buffer that you've got, let's say it's 20%, is quite useful from two perspectives. Firstly, it gives you some leeway if prices fall, but the other is the interest rate that you might get is a little bit better, because the banks tend to have a bit of a sense of, 95%, no, it's a more risky loan, and therefore the other side of this is the nature and structure of the loan. And I want to touch on that from two perspectives: the interest rates that people are likely to get, and the term of the loan that they're likely to get. Because the other thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people are thinking, oh, I need to get a 35-year loan or 30-year loan or whatever, right? But just remember, folks, that means you're paying a lot longer and a lot more interest to the bank. So the bank loves it because that means they've got this longer duration, but you are paying a lot more. And so these two factors are not factors that actually many people are talking about. But Aaron, you started poking the bear.
Yeah, that's right. So we might start with the curve first then. I like to think, and the numbers specifically on this slide aren't important. The shape of the curve really is what's important here. And in either of those situations, monthly or fortnightly, again, that's not super important in the point of what I'm going to say next. But I like to think of repaying a principal and interest loan in sort of three chunks. And if you took a standard 30-year loan term, then you're talking about it really in terms of 3 decades. The first decade is where you're making your repayments every fortnight or every month, but you're making very, very little headway against the principal amount. Most of what you're paying is going towards the interest. Very little of that is actually chipping away at your principal. And the second sort of period there is a bit more 50-50. You're making repayments against the principal, and that's coming down quite nicely. But you're also paying for the interest on that remaining amount. And then the final decade, if anybody ever gets there, is where you're really making substantial repayments against the principal amount. And as that's coming down more rapidly, you're paying less interest essentially on the remaining principal there. And so by taking a 95% loan, what you're really doing is prolonging and making more painful that difficult part of the cycle already. That difficult sort of first 10 years where you're making very little headway against the principal amount of your loan. And so if you're only starting with 5% equity, you might find that after 10 years of repayments, you're not much more than 5% equity. And if it's going to cost you a couple of percent on that to even sell your property, in some extreme instances, you could be going backward quite rapidly, or at the very least not making as much headway as you think you are because of the nature of that curve and how much interest. And like you just said, the banks will be making an absolute mozza off these loans. And we know that people that are only holding those properties for sort of 7 to 10 years won't be making much headway against their principal amount. They just can't. They just can't afford it. And the shape of that curve is not designed for them to be able to make much headway. And as I said, I think it's going to get a lot worse with people taking out 95% loans. The second point you touched on, Martin, I think is on the next slide. So we wrote an article last week. I looked at some of the bank pricing of their interest rates and what they were offering first home buyers. And what I really found shocked me. Now, this article that was on news.com.au is actually an updated version, a republished version, if you like. The original article mentioned all 4 major banks, and that picture you can see on the right-hand side of the screen had all 4 bank logos. And then I noticed in a subsequent update to this article, one of the banks was removed, both from the picture and also from the text there. And so I got in touch with the journalist and asked why that was the case. And she expressed to me that that bank had reached out to her and said that my comments about their rates were factually inaccurate. Now, I can tell you exactly what I said about that bank and about their rates. The first thing I said was that their products on 80% loans, they were offering a digital product at a really, really good rate. I think it was about 5.39% that they offered, but it was only offered to loan-to-value ratios at 80% or less. Even going to 81% LVR, that product was not available to you. And then of the remaining standard principal and interest, so not the fixed rate loans, but their principal and interest loans, the simple loan and the variable loans, they were offered at higher rates all the way up to 95% LVR. And I'm not talking by a small amount either. I think the top rate was like 6.5 or 6.9% or something like that. So, you're essentially getting slugged an extra 1.6% because you're taking a higher loan amount. Now, if you go back, traditionally speaking, or I guess up until this evening, I have no issue with banks charging higher rates for riskier loans. I think that works with their business model, and essentially that's what they've always done. But the difference, and I'll be waking up and checking all of the bank screens tomorrow morning, the difference is that anybody who's applying for these products under the Federal Home Guarantee Scheme, essentially that's no extra risk to the bank. The bank is taking on no more risk for those loans above 80% than they are for those loans at 80%. And so the question really should be asked, why are they charging higher rates to first homeowners if the bank is not taking on any more material risk for those products above 80%? That was the question that we were essentially asking. The tangible thing we were calling for was that the banks do offer those 80% rates to first homeowners that are applying under that scheme because they're simply not taking on any extra risk. I can see other loan types, and you might want to do investor loans at higher amounts for riskier loans, but specifically for those government-supported loans that are being taken out, there are no extra risk to the bank. Why are they charging higher rates for those loans? And just before coming on the show tonight, I thought, let me just check to see if any of the big bank websites have been updated, knowing that tomorrow this scheme is supposed to be extended. It is already in effect, to be fair. And sure enough, all of those loans are offered at higher rates for higher LVRs. And I think even if magically we wake up tomorrow morning and see all those rates drop down for first homeowners, it hasn't allowed people to plan and prepare for that situation, for them to be able to do their numbers, to work out what they can afford. And so I suspect that we'll wake up tomorrow morning, Martin, and those rates won't be updated to match the 80% for first home buyers. And I really think that the banks are leveraging this opportunity to price gouge against these first homeowners. And if you think about it logically, it's counterintuitive to what the government are trying to achieve by being able to help people afford more, more affordable places. Essentially, it's a wealth transfer from your back pocket to the bank's back pocket.
Yes. Well, the banks win out, don't they? And, if you look at the proportion of lending from the banks, it's now 2/3 to property, 1/3 to the rest of the economy. It was reversed from 20, 30 years ago. And they're always looking for more cannon fodder. It's interesting, there are a few banks now talking about offering other incentives, cash incentives, or even things like frequent flyer points or something to try and actually attract people. But of course, you've got to weigh that up against the real cost of the loan over the life of the loan. And if the interest rate's higher and it stays higher, then you're going to pay a lot more in interest over the life of the loan. So it will be very interesting to see how this plays out. Now, of course, Chris Bates on the other night on the channel said, well, go to a mortgage broker, they can help you navigate this. And I think that's true to an extent. But if the basic philosophy of the banks is they're going to take the 95% as the amount of the loan, not the 80%, because of the fact the government's guaranteeing the 15%, but it's still 95%, most people will end up paying a higher interest rate for their first-time buyer loan than they perhaps expected that they might, with all the consequences.
And to further illustrate this point, I ran a scenario where you had essentially two couples that both took out $1 million loan. One was taken out against the 80% LVR, and another was against the 95. Now, maybe you're talking about two houses across for each other, $1 million loan on a freestanding house with an 80% LVR, and you're talking about $1 million loan against an apartment with a 95% LVR. Same amount of cash, same amount of loan size, two different properties, and based on the material value of those properties, you get wildly different amounts that those homeowners need to repay each month. You're talking in the order of $1,000 or more per month simply because of the rate difference there. Same loan size, but just different LVR, and you've got those first homeowners paying $1,000 more per month. And we're, I guess, to lead into my next point, essentially we're talking about people that aren't able to get a 20% deposit together. So, how does that make sense when essentially people are only able to get together a 5% deposit, and perhaps for a variety of good reasons that they're only able to do that, but yet they're able to get together an extra $1,000 a month simply because they have to pay a higher interest rate on that thing. And as I said, at no more risk to the financial institution.
No, actually, in fact, with the government guarantee, it's probably less risk, right? Because it means that they can afford to turn down. But I also make the point, of course, it's not the government, it's the taxpayer who's actually on the hook for this. So if, in fact, we have a significant property correction in a year or two or three time, and prices do fall, well, guess what? It's taxpayers who pick up the bill. So it goes back to this idea of this wealth transference thing going on, and the property market being supported by the government directly and indirectly, and not least because of the fact that it's taxpayers' money that is being used for this. So I always am worried about that. It goes back to what I said at the top of the show about the amount of debt in the system is still rising, and the government deficit's still rising. They're throwing a lot of money at the housing sector because it's the only game in town in terms of trying to keep the economy going. And Michelle Bullock talked about the wealth effect from housing and from superannuation and from shares in the commentary today and the press conference, and that's again a little bit of a sort of a fallacious argument in my view. It's not really necessarily good economic momentum. It's the business investment, which is going to be the critical thing for the future. And it's going to be something beyond housing, which is critical for the future of Australia. And yet at the moment, the government's spending a lot of time, effort, and money talking up and supporting the housing market directly. So I've got a bit of a problem with this. And I also think that looking at individuals, sure, you might be one of the lucky ones who actually get in and can get a property. Productivity Commission's report recently suggested most of the people who will benefit from these types of schemes would have bought in the next little while anyway. It just brings it forward, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem of housing unaffordability for a large proportion of the population who still can't get into the market in these situations. So it doesn't really address the root causes of housing affordability. What it is doing is just putting lipstick on a pig.
And if it didn't help people at an 80% LVR interest rate, how is it going to help people at a 95% LVR interest rate? An interest rate that's up to a whopping 1.6% extra to repay that money. I just think it's quite ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. Well, we'll see a 14.99% decline in property prices. You're probably right. Exactly. Just by the amount of the government support, but no more. That's a very good point.
But, the other thing is, because you mentioned essentially we the people becoming the insurance provider, for that credit, right?
Yeah.
In any insurance product, you're supposed to get something back in return for the risk you take on that somebody does default, right? So where is essentially the interest coming back to the people, every month from the banks to be able to say, okay, if somebody does default, sure, we'll pay out, but we're collecting, from you every month to make sure that doesn't happen. I think people should be getting a better rate than 80% rather than, a worse rate. Absolutely.
Yeah, and as Otto said, of course, quite often people ultimately have to move, on average every 7 years. It does vary, of course, which means effectively then you're actually starting this interest payment program story again. So effectively, if you look at the life of an individual rather than actually an average loan life, and look at how much they're actually paying in terms of interest over their life, it's quite significant. And also, of course, a lot of people now are borrowing later initially. So housing formation is 10 years later than it used to be, which means that people are borrowing more later. And that means that when they come to retirement, they've still got a mortgage around their neck, and they either then have to try and pay it off when they want to retire or go on working for longer. So there are a lot of social and economic implications and consequences of what we're doing here. And I've always had the view that, this isn't necessarily the smartest move. I'll also make just another point. I'll just put this slide up if I can find it. Yeah, it should be that one here. This is the 3-year Aussie rate at the moment, and you can see it's now at 3.35, and you can see it's popped up again. It was hovering around 3.3 back in July. So the expectation there is that because the 3 years a good proxy. 2-year was also a little higher at 3.52. The 10-year is now at 4.3, which is interesting because it was actually quite a bit higher at 4.4. But you can see earlier in September, we were at 4.2. And there are people out there who are thinking that the longer term rates, which perhaps will be more impacted by what's going on internationally with Trump and tariffs and all the other stuff there, means that in fact the cost of credit will be quite a lot higher, which means that some of the interest rates that we are seeing on the fixed rates are actually a little higher than they were previously already. So there's a lot of international uncertainty. And going back to your waves analogy, we've talked about some of the immediate things around health and circumstances and those sorts of things, the quality of the property. But you've also got this international story too, with what Trump is doing is throwing more tariffs all over the place at the moment, and that's putting a lot of pressure on markets too. And when you put it all together, you've got to say, well, there's a bit of risk around out there as well. And I don't know whether you saw all the latest discussion, but I thought this was quite. If I can just find it, it's here somewhere. Where is it? Yeah, just one second. I've got a little meme which Mr. Trump put up the other day. If I can find it, let's find it. Hang on, can I find it? It's here somewhere. There you go. Let's put it up. There you go. This is what he published the other day. He's firing Jerome Powell, and there is international uncertainty about the story with regard to central banks and central bankers. Look, I've got a theory. I've had it for some time. I think central banks are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And when you actually are thinking about what to do if you're a prospective first-time buyer, don't necessarily be persuaded by what central banks are telling you, because they don't really know. Their forecasts are pretty bad, and you can see that Michelle is pivoting towards potentially higher inflation and higher interest rates. The markets are saying higher interest rates. That means that effectively people are going to have less benefit from lower rates ahead. And one of the things I see in my surveys quite often from first-time buyers is it's going to be a real struggle to get into the market. But of course, over time, income is going to rise, interest rates are coming down, so it'll be fine later. Except in my surveys, I'm still seeing people who are down the track, 3 to 5 years down the track, still struggling with trying to balance the budget, and actually in some cases, having to cut back on spending simply to pay the mortgage. So it is important to do, I think, a 5 to 7 year horizon when you're thinking about property. And Chris Bates said the same. Don't just think about it as a year or two. Think about it slightly longer. Run some cash flows and those things, and run some counterfactuals. And I guess the bottom line from my perspective is there will be some people who will benefit from this, but strategically, I have my doubts.
Yes, yeah. No, I tend to agree with you, and I think that you can't always predict the waves that are going to come along and rock the boat. And look, maybe there are things that are completely outside of your control. You're not going to be able to do much about it. There might be global forces. You might work for CSL and find that Australian medical goods have just been hit with 100% tariff that you weren't expecting. You might work in Australian film and television and find that that the movies we export are hit with a 100% tariff, and you couldn't have predicted that either. And so it's certainly good to think about what you can control and how you can manage your finances. You can also, you've got to be prepared to roll with the punches, as they say, as well. I just think it's so important that people have the buffer to be able to do that, and that they're not forced to go underwater at the slightest little ripple.
Absolutely. In fact, a Cookie Boy put this post up, which is just worth going into a bit more detail. We're in the 1970s all over again. I think we probably are. We cut way too soon. Yes, I tend to agree with that. In fact, he mentioned Roger Brown. Roger Brown was a very smart, older individual who we had on the show a few times years ago. He died, unfortunately, now. But he was talking about all of this sort of cycle with inflation starting to stir again. And, he was saying, be careful, because at that stage rates were quite a lot lower and people were leveraging up. But of course, inflation hasn't gone away. And it's interesting, of course, that, people are saying, when will the rate cycle end? Greg said the rate cutting cycle has to end eventually. Then there'll be a rate hiking cycle. Have you any idea about when it is? No, I don't really know, because it depends on some of these externalities. What I do think is we are close to the end of the rate cutting cycle. Markets are now saying maybe one rate cut next year, maybe, but that was way down from where it was previously. But if the inflation story continues to be a little stronger, and I think it's likely, I mentioned the enterprise wage agreements just at the top of the show there, the chances are we could be at the end of the rate cutting cycle. We'll wobble along sideways for some time, but what if the next move were up? That's the question to think about. And generally, if rates start to move up, we don't just get one, we get 2 or 3 or whatever, right? And remember, long-term interest rates are still relatively higher compared with now. So we are not actually in ultra cheap rate range, maybe, but we're not necessarily in long-term average range either. So there is always the potential that things could actually go up a little bit. Otto is suggesting that middle of 2026 with currents. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable bet. And it depends on lots of things. What's going to happen to the dollar? What's going to happen to the US? All those sorts of things too. But there is a lot of thought here that people are still banking on significant rate cuts, and they sort of are thinking back to the the COVID and post-COVID emergency rate levels. Well, then I don't think central banks will ever do that again. Central banks triggered inflation because of those ultra low rate cuts and because of the massive flooding of the liquidity in the system that they did, first from the global financial crisis, but then second from the COVID. They created the problem. So I'm not sure that we should rely on central banks to solve the problem. And
the only way I can see that that they might go much lower than expected is if that meddling, and going back to your meme there, a moment ago, it's not to say that there won't be some pressure, a lot of pressure, direct pressure applied to get rates, much lower. Now, the question and the point you're making is, should they be that low again? And I think there's, absolutely not. Will they be that low again? Well, who knows?
Well, it goes back to the political impact. And look, my belief is that the Reserve Bank is as a political institution of any other institution. So they're not above politics. They're not, completely disconnected from it. And it seems to me that if you look at what Trump is doing, he's definitely injecting more political influence on the Fed to try and cut rates for various reasons. But that will lead to higher inflation again. And the inflationary impacts, somebody earlier on said, the problem with inflation is it's like a continued pain problem. It reduces your spending capacity. And even Michelle Bullock said in the press conference today, prices are a lot higher than they were. They're not going lower. So we are now at this.
You said that several times.
Yeah, we're at this new level now. But what it means is that when you actually think of household budgets and trying to balance, money coming in, money going out, well, okay, some people are experiencing wages growth. I'm not seeing a lot, but people are also still seeing significant price rises working through. And so, again, if I'm modeling out this through my surveys, I'm still seeing a lot of households in financial pressure where they're having to make these very tough decisions about what they spend their money on. And we really have not got a way out of this problem. I guess the question, and I think somebody asked this question a little, Cookie Boy asked, so what's our solution? What you think, Aaron? Cut migration, remove negative gearing, give more tax perks to owner-occupiers. I don't personally think that we should be giving any more incentives for owner-occupiers. I think we should be looking quite hard at some of the incentives for the investment sector who've done very well. But migration is one of the obvious things which needs to be addressed. The other is the cost of energy. And the cost of energy, of course, is driven high simply because of bad policy with regard to the gas and gas reservations and those things. So there are things that the government could do, but for some reason, they don't seem to be wanting to tackle those structural issues. The migration story is still one where they're still saying, no, we need very strong migration. Why? Because Treasury needs everybody to pay more tax. Well, you saw the tax bill was up. Gee, well, that's a surprise. But the fact of the matter is that without dealing with the energy problem and the migration problem, we're going to find the housing sector continuing to be out of reach for many. We're going to be seeing more money from taxpayers being thrown back to first-time buyers to try and get them back into the market. And we're going to see more first-time buyers lured into going to the market without necessarily doing their due diligence, leveraging up. The banks will love that. They will amount significant price profit improvement for their shares and significant margin improvement for their business. And by the way, the banks at the same time are shaving the rates to depositors quite significantly. That's how they're making all of this work at the moment. So to my mind, we have a bit of a problem. But look, as we come towards the end of the show, Aaron, your final thoughts, if you are a prospective first-time buyer, what are some of the questions that you should be thinking about?
Well, sadly, I have more questions myself than answers. You put the disclaimer at the top of the show that you always have. This is not financial advice, and I'm not going to give any sort of financial advice this evening, or quite frankly, any other time. I think that situations are so personal that people need to really understand themselves, their situations, their financial goals, their housing goals as well, their career goals, all of those sorts of things before jumping in. I'm not saying that people should always save up for a larger deposit and a larger deposit and a larger deposit. And I do see the commentary around the affordability of housing getting away from people's ability to save. So I'm very sympathetic to that. All I'm really calling for is two things. Firstly, on the consumer side, is a degree of measure when it comes to understanding your financial position, and before you jump in and sort of ride that FOMO wave, really understand, can you afford it, or should you be waiting a little bit longer to be able to get a better deal and a better rate. Going back to some of those bank products, there's the difference between an 80% loan and an 80.1% loan, is nearly a full percentage when it comes to your interest rate. And so, we might be talking $1,000, and it makes a huge difference to the rate that you're getting. And it'd probably take you another 12 months to renegotiate that lower. So could you just save just one more $1,000 and to be able to get a better rate? That's the kind of thing I would really be encouraging people to do, is really understand what they can afford, what rate they can get to be able to capitalise that. And if you want to go onto the bank websites and play around with it, most of them have got sort of mortgage rate calculators and things like that. You can say, okay, if I take out $800,000 on $1 million property, what rate can I get? And if it's $800,000, and $1, what rate will I get for that? And you might be shocked as to the answers that you get there. So definitely, do your due diligence in that regard. The second thing is, and I made mention of it at the top of the show, I'd really like to see the banks coming on board to support the whole of government initiative to be able to make it more affordable for people. And I'll come back to the word affordable. I think we'll end there this evening, and I finally get to explain my Christmas sweater as well, the word affordable. But, I'd really love to see the banks offering better rates for first homeowners, particularly those that are subscribed under the scheme. As I've mentioned at length this evening, it's of no extra risk to the financial institutions. And so they should be offering people a loan that's commensurate with the government's broader desire to make it no less risky for loans above 80%. So those are probably the two things, Martin. And then I guess moving on to my final point this evening, the reason for the Christmas sweater, the bonus, the night before mortgage debt Christmas Eve, it really comes back to that word affordable, right? There you go. There's my little AI image of a puppy on Christmas Eve. Thank you, ChatGPT, for putting that image together for me. I think it might have been Gemini, actually, that one. Martin, I'll pose this question to you, and it comes back to the word affordability. If I gave you a new puppy for Christmas, or for your birthday, happy birthday, by the way, just because it's free for you to receive it, or in a housing context, it's cheap for you to obtain it in the first place, does that mean you can afford it? Or is the real question, even if you didn't put much money into getting it, is affordability broader and it goes to whether or not you can keep it on a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month basis. That is really the question, and I think people are going to see social media tomorrow absolutely plastered with messaging around affordability and how much more affordable it is for young people to be able to buy a property. Feel free to tag us in each one of those you see on social media tomorrow. I think social media is really going to blow up around this word affordability, and everything is going to be couched in from the perspective of, well, housing is now much more affordable because you can get a new property with hardly any money down. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is just because you didn't put much into getting it, and perhaps it was a new puppy and it was given to you for free, does that mean it's affordable, or do you still have to put money into keeping it day by day, month by month, year by year?
As they say, a puppy isn't just for Christmas, right? It's for life. And a property is for life too. And it amazes me how often I have conversations with people, a year or two after they've bought, and they're regretting the purchase. It was the wrong property. They didn't do the due diligence. They've actually ended up with higher expenses. And by the way, a lot of the disappointment is coming from the high-rise sector, where the strata fees have just gone through the roof. And so people are paying a lot more than they thought they were going to be paying for strata fees. But of course, if you have your own property, you've still got to keep it maintained. You've got to look after it. And unfortunately, properties do degrade over time. They need ongoing maintenance. So that's something else that people don't think. And interestingly, when I chat with people sometimes in my one-on-ones, I get them to just sort of list out the additional costs of owning a property. And it's quite interesting. Things like power, things like the council tax or whatever the fees will be there. And there's a bunch of additional fees and charges that just run out, and it's actually becoming quite expensive when you sit down and think about it. And quite often, when you actually look at the spreadsheet that they actually put together to justify to the bank that they could afford, it doesn't include a lot of those costs. And I don't think the banks do a very good job with people, helping them to really understand what their true affordability level is. Remembering that the banks use the HEM, these models that really are understating the real spending patterns of most people, but that's the ones they use. So for many people, they actually end up with a property that is something that is really going to be a drag on their finances. And okay, it's always tough to get into your first property. You're always going to have to make sacrifices, but grading the level of those sacrifices is the critical question. And I worry with you that we're going to see spruiking to high heavens we saw from that real estate story I played earlier on. People are going to get misled. They're going to get in over their heads. And therefore, your thoughts with regard to the snorkel is really spot on. And I would congratulate you on coming up with that very, very strong image, which hopefully will help people perhaps just pause and think before they jump in, literally, and get over their heads.
Indeed, and I'm surprised it stayed on for the night too, or for the most part at least. And I guess this, a final thought to illustrate that ease of entry does not equal affordability. You remember you used to see, I don't know if you see them very much anymore, but you used to see lottery groups or different charity groups auctioning off mega mansions to people, a $2 ticket, you win this beachfront property and all that. Sounds really appealing. Essentially, you have a low entry cost and a wonderful sort of prize at the end. But what you often saw, I think far more often than not, is people just couldn't afford to keep them. People just could not afford to maintain that prize themselves. So low barrier to entry does not equal affordability is my point there.
That is a really, really important point. And yes, it is important. And look, we just come back to the same old in a way. Do your due diligence. Make sure you don't get in over your head. Make sure that you understand the motivations of the banks and understand the motivations of the real estate sector as well. There is a clear need for people to go buy property, but buy the right property and don't get in over your heads. And just to answer Steve's question, how realistic is the Henderson Property Index? Well, the HEM, which is what they use these days, no, it's not. It's not realistic at all because, again, according to my analysis, people are actually spending a lot more just on day-to-day things, and healthcare costs, insurance costs. That's another big one that people forget quite often as well. Getting around, tolls, for example. A lot of people are buying property where there are big toll fees to get around, which they're not factoring in. That there's a really important question here. And so, as Cookie says, it's very important to ignore the spruikers and those with self-vested interests and do your own due diligence. Aaron, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Even just a quick plug for your service. Do you want to just tell people about that before we go?
Yeah, sure. bRight Agent. We operate Australia-wide and help people save money when they're selling their property by getting real estate agents to offer more transparent and competitive commission rates. And I think we're all used to price comparisons with, buying a new TV or a car and walking in and say, hey, can you match that rate? And essentially there's nowhere in Australia to be able to do that and get agents to offer you a more competitive rate. There's a lot of different ways to choose an agent. We think price should be one of them. Not the only, certainly, but price should be one of them. And if you're going to great lengths to save 0.25% on your home loan rate, why not save as much as you can on your agent's commission rate as well, or at least get them to offer you the best rate you can and make an informed decision. It's your house at the end of the day. You've worked bloody hard for it, so you should keep as much equity in your back pockets as you can. So bRight Agent, operate Australia-wide from our little app, which is getting its first major makeover in the next few days, which is quite exciting. And look forward to be able to connect you with a local agent that will offer you a great rate.
Great, thank you. Links are in the comments below for that particular site, and it's definitely worth a look. You can definitely shave some of the costs away, and of course, when you're buying a property, it all helps. Aaron, thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Congratulations on your work with regard to these interest rates and scaring one of the banks, which was quite funny. And thank you very much for turning up with your jumper and your headwear. That certainly has created quite a lot of amusement. But as Otto said a little while ago, oops, he's gone. It was a very apposite, analogy for what's going on at the moment. So. Thanks, Aaron. Thank you very much also to everybody else for coming on this evening and spending some time with us. The dogs are still here, I think. Yes, they are. So we could just look at the doggies. There we go. The doggies are still there. And sound asleep. We didn't really have much noise from them today, which was quite good. Just to say that next week, it's going to be the monthly market review as normal. And that, of course, will be same time next week. So we'll be talking with Nucleus Wealth, and that'll be a fun conversation to have there, and particularly look at whether we're going to move into October with a potential fall. Remember that September and October tend to be the months where the most significant falls. And so Damien Klassen will be on, and we'll be discussing specifically whether markets are too hot and whether they're likely to fall, or whether there's enough momentum, particularly from AI, to keep the story going. So that'll be an interesting show. Mark your diary for that one. And the following week, I'll be on to talk again about my mortgage stress and modeling. Steve, thank you so much for the super chat. Really appreciate that. And I hope you found it useful, interesting, and I appreciate your contribution to what we do around here. And thank you very much to Cookie as well. And the dogs are still drunk. They're off for the next walk shortly. So there we are. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a good evening. Keep safe. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the live show next week. And indeed, of course, check out the recorded shows that are posted each day. And of course, my shorts as well, which are also getting quite a lot of coverage too. So thank you very much. Take care. We'll see you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Cheerio.